Hey, hello everybody. It's a cold day in Melbourne today. You'd think we were back in winter. We're in the early part of February, so go figure, as they say. So I hope you're all well, and we're going to tackle another chapter in my trip, or my time in South Africa, I think is more appropriate as a title. Some of you like the image of the heralds with their own little individualised tin mugs drinking their tea from Polly. I'm having a tea myself today. Thank you, Polly. Bring out the bread. So yeah, I mentioned last episode the time in the Park Hotel was coming to an end. I guess it was getting a bit cramped. It was living on top of a hotel. There were fights, a lot of noise, a lot of people coming and going. And I suspect that Dad had some sort of romantic liaison with this woman, a Boer, big fat Boer woman, straight out of the Ford Trekkers. Her name was June. Didn't take very long, and this woman did not like me, and I didn't like her. So she ran some sort of a boarding house on Derby Avenue in Brakpan. And when we initially got there, Dad and I took a room, and Aidan was staying in one of the granny flats in the back of the property. Well, I came home from school one day to find that my bed had been moved out of the room, and I'd been put in another room with June's son, who was some vagrant, sort of 19-year-old, budding alcoholic, drug addict that would be stumbling and falling over my bed in the middle of the night. Turned out that June had romantic notions on my dad, and she didn't think it was appropriate that I was sharing a room with Dad. It got pretty nasty. She told Dad on one occasion that I'd been telling my school friends that Dad had molested me. She used to steal my stamps that I'd bought from the stamp club. They'd come over from England. It was really exciting getting an envelope with my name on it from England. And she'd steal my stamps and then give them back to me as a reward. She fed my pet rat, Joey, to her dogs. So you're getting the idea of this. She was a psychopath. I was spending a lot of time with Dad going to work with him. She thought that was highly inappropriate. But sometimes I'd go to the afternoon shift with Dad, and I'd help in the bakery, putting bread rolls in bags of 12 and talking to the African workers. Sometimes they'd take me out the back where the African workers lived. We're talking in the Standard Bakery here in Brakpan, and I'd go and sit in these, they were just concrete accommodation for the workers. No women were allowed back there, just for the workers, and there were no glass on the windows, and they'd sleep on iron bunks, and sometimes I'd go out the back with them. Some of the tastiest food I ever had was with these Africans. They did cook this lamb, I remember, in an old tin with a bit of salt and some oil on a fire, and I ate with them, and I still remember it was just delicious. You might see this black rubber band on my arm. That is from the Standard Bakery in those days, and I've never had that off in 50 years, over 50 years. So I was spending a lot of time with Dad in the bakery, and it was a bit of a challenge. I used to try and stay awake as long as I could, but inevitably, around about 11 or midnight, my eyes would start getting heavy, and things would slow up in the bakery. Dad would just sort of be waiting out the clock, and I'd creep off to the storeroom, and there were the bags of flour that were stacked like that, and you'd get when you got to the top, it was warm in there. You'd get the Africans that were sleeping in their baking whites, in their overalls and their aprons. They'd be up there asleep, curled up, and I'd sort of join them, and we'd be like mice curled up in this little nookie. And of course, eventually Dad would come and wake me and say it's time to go home, and I'd arrive back at June's place covered in flour, and I might have a few hours sleep, and then I'd be up to school, and she didn't like that. She tried to separate Dad and I, and even Aidan copped a blood nose one time. He came in and one of June's son's friends had snotted Aiden one in the face, so we had to get out of there. So we moved into some flats, Toymar flats they were called, and that was a feeling of great relief once we got into those flats. They were fairly modern. Aiden again was moving away from us, spending time with his friends out on the outskirts of Brakpan, and so Dad and I got a chance to bond. Now about this time Dad bought his first car, or new car, that I can remember anyhow. He probably had a new car in Brighton, but he bought a Austin Apache in Brakpan from the car dealership, which was pretty much opposite the Toymar flats, and it was sky blue, as I recall. It had beautiful tan leather upholstery and it looked pretty snazzy. It was a bit of a sports car. It had the steering wheel with the holes in the spokes of the steering wheel, so a bit sporty. It turned out to be a lemon, but he didn't know that at the time. But it enabled us to do more and more things together. Now, one of those places I've mentioned before to you was Swaziland. How that came to be was one of Dad's workers was a fella called Joseph, who was married to Martha. Now, they had no children. She was unable to conceive, and they really took to me. And for quite a while, Dad and Joseph were in talks about starting a bakery in Swaziland. Joseph would have it in his name. Dad would help set it up and, order in the equipment and get it up and running. And we had visions of going to live in Swaziland. Swaziland was fantastic. So what I'm going to tell you is one experience we had out of many, because once we discovered this place, and through Joseph, who gave us the instructions to get to his village, and we'd go and stay with his family back in the village, we started going fairly irregularly because there was no apartheid. South Africa was oppressive and backwards, whereas Swaziland was a breath of fresh air. We'd go horseback riding. There was a place called Sheba's Breast, which sounds a bit naughty. It was sort of a mountain shaped like a boob, I suppose. Dad liked to tell us that this was taken from Solomon's Mines, at the land that had been written about by H. Rider Haggard was describing Swaziland. So, but on this occasion, I think it was just Dad and I. Yeah, it was. So we set off from Brakpan, and it was probably a Friday after work when Dad had finished, and we drove into the night, and we got to the border of Swaziland. It was pitch black, so I'm saying about 9 or 10 at night. Now we'd organised this, and we parked the car, we turned the lights off, and after a few minutes we heard a rustle and whispered voices, and there were these Swazis. They jumped over the fence. It was only like a barbed wire fence, which was the border at that part of Swaziland. And Dad handed me over to them, and he started the car and he drove off. So he had another hour or so to get to the border post to cross into Swaziland, have his passport checked and all that, and then by the time he would curve and wind all the way back through these dirt tracks, it would take him a couple of hours for him to get back to the village where I was now heading. So off he went into the distance. It must have been an incredible amount of trust with these people, but they were such kind, hospitable people. I've loved the African people ever since. So off we set. There was perhaps 3 or 4 African women. Some of them had the blankets with the baby on their backs. There was a couple of men that were leading us, and it was pitch black. The only thing I could hear occasionally were the bells from the cattle as they would move in the dark, and you'd hear that clanking of the cowbell. Occasionally we walked through a village where people would say hello to us, and there'd be a fire, and it was all pretty quiet. There wasn't a lot of noise going on. People seemed to speak in whispered tones. It was probably highly illegal what we were doing. But off we went. We walked single file. We went over hill, down dale, through valleys. As I said, passing through other villages until we got back to Joseph's village, and they took me in and they made me tea. They made some food for me. And then after a couple of hours we heard the approaching sound of an engine, and it was the Austin Apache, and you could see it in the distance, and there was a single track coming along with high grass in the middle, and the car tyres would have made the track for Dad to follow. And he arrived, and they heated up the food. They tended to, they only had one dish on the menu, which was very generous of them. But you'd arrive and you'd hear the squawking of a chicken, and within about an hour they'd present this chicken, which tended to be sort of boiled, I think. There was a rice dish, which I quite liked, and there was a tomato and onion sort of gravy that they put on the rice dish. I enjoyed that, but the chicken tended to have bits of feather still in it. I mean, it was very kind of them to give one of our chickens to us, but yeah, I never really enjoyed the chicken stuff. But so yeah, that was one occasion. Now the story I'm going to tell you is I'm not sure if it happened on that time or it was around about that time. But we went to a friend of Joseph's who was turning 21, and we were the guests of honour, Dad and I. And we were sat at a special part of the table. We'd never met this fella or family before. We sat at the table, and we were made to be, guests of honour. And we were, even though Dad was asked to give some speeches for the kids, 21st. So through them, we got invited to go to one of the independence celebrations of Swaziland. Swaziland had been an English protectorate that had gained independence in the 1960s. So we went to this big stadium, which was fairly new at the time. Their capital was Maban, I think. And we were sat in this big stadium with lots of people and dignitaries around us. Way down below us was a podium where the King Sabuza, sat. He was quite an elderly man then, but he lived many years after that. He had about 100 wives. So at some stage these festivities began. There were some army troops marching around, not many of them. There were one or two jets flew overhead. But the bit that got me was the big gates into the stadium opened, and you heard all the chanting of the warriors coming, and also the maidens. I think the maidens might have come in first. There was about 1,000 of these African girls came in with grass skirts, perky little boobs, and they had little like wands of reed or elephant tail or something, and they would dance and they would chant the king's name, and whether they were his maidens, I don't know. So they moved to the side, and then came the good bit. And this is when we heard the warriors coming, and they were slamming their shields, their spears against their shields. And Goda, Yagato, Etapitwana, and poof, poof, as they came into the stadium. And there were even some white men that were dressed in traditional Swazi, which is very, as I said in another video, very similar to the Zulu look. And then they came and they would rush up to the king, and then they would all drop and Swatihano, Swatihano, and it would echo around the stadium. Oh, it was fantastic. I've never forgotten of it. So, yeah, we were very privileged to see and do those sorts of things. Some of Joseph's friends were Swazi police that we stayed with in Swaziland at one stage. Dad's brother came out, Uncle John, who was a policeman in Melbourne, in Frankston. He came out with a girlfriend, and we took them over to Swaziland. I remember Dad set them up with this policeman. Dad thought Uncle John would be interested to see how the Swazi police worked and functioned. So Dad found accommodation at one of the hostels where these police were staying, and they had gone out of their way. They'd given up their room for Uncle John and his girlfriend to sleep. I think Uncle John and his girlfriend looked around, and 5 minutes later Uncle John was called to have a talk with the girlfriend, and she said, "I'm not staying here." They felt unsafe, and so they went and got themselves in a hotel. How are we going for time? I'm trying to keep these to about 20 minutes. Yeah, so we, as I said, we were staying now in the Toymar flats. It felt fairly modern, it felt fairly new. Still going to State Mines to see the Heralds fairly often, but becoming a little more friendly with Brian Gould as the Heralds started to change a bit. One character we're going to encounter is a fellow called Pete. Pete was an Afrikaner that lived on the State Mines a few doors up from the Heralds. And we noticed that the Heralds started to hang out with this fella more and more, and these days you'd probably be quite suspicious of, he was probably, I'd say, mid-20s, and the Herald kids were, 14, 15. 14 and 15, I say, the older ones that were hanging out with him, and even Dennis, the 10-year-old, they were hanging out in his car. He had this green Mercedes, and you'd sometimes be walking around Brackpan and see this lime green Mercedes drive past with Pitt at the wheel, and these kids hanging out of the windows yelling at you, and they started speaking Afrikaans more and more, and seemingly abandoning their English. So, look, I think we'll leave it there for the moment. As I said, becoming more and more friends with Brian Gould. My time at Brackpan Primary, or Brenters, was finishing, and I was going to be starting at Brackpan High soon. And once again, we were looking at moving. The time in the flat wasn't that long. Dad desired to have a house again with a garden for some reason, a bit more room, perhaps. So let's leave it there. Hope you're enjoying these. Subscribe and click on that bell so you get the notifications. I did do a Boer War one yesterday with my new Osmo camera, and not happy with the result. I've got to figure out what I'm doing wrong. So once we've done that, we're back to the Boer War, but until then, over and out.